If you really want to help Ukraine, you want to preserve Ukraine, then you have to be serious about pressing forward with these negotiations which President Trump has worked very hard to bring about. But now is the moment for Ukraine to be realistic about where it is and to understand that this is its last chance. If the Ukrainians fluff this, if they make impossible demands, if they say that they're only interested in a ceasefire and nothing else, if they go on saying that they have an irreversible right to join NATO and that they want all their 4 territories returned and anything of that kind, then the war will continue. The Russians, as I said, are full of confidence and they will see it through. And at the end of it, there is a very strong possibility indeed, a real possibility that there will be no Ukraine. So, I mean, Medvedev said it absolutely straightforwardly and very, very clearly. And the audience is receptive to this. As I said, to repeat again, these are lawyers. These are not people who were, if you like, drawn from the military industrial complex. They're not soldiers. They're not people of that kind. They are the kind of people who, if you like, have been exposed most to the rupture with the West. A lot of them worked for law firms that do international work. They've been affected by the sanctions. They've had their business, to some extent, affected by all of this. But nonetheless, and in spite of that, they support completely what Medvedev said. I didn't come across anybody who took a different view. Anybody at all.
And that's whether Russian or any other countries?
Well, I mean, people from other countries, no doubt. I mean, I didn't want to talk about that too much because obviously they've got their own perspectives. But what I will say this, again, there was people from India, people from Angola, people from other countries as well. Their overall sense seemed to be that the war is the product of Western overreach, that we pushed the Russians into a corner, and they would prefer, I think, to see a negotiated end to the war because of the disruptions it's causing to the international system. They would probably not want to see Ukraine disappear. In fact, they definitely wouldn't. Yeah. But ultimately, if that happens, my sense is most of them will accept it and they will blame the West.
Wow, that's quite a telling statement there, that others will not blame Russia, because on the U.S. side especially, and on the European side, as we're going to see here shortly, most of the blame, if not all the blame, actually all the blame is put on Russia. But I want to play one more clip, because if anybody wasn't sure what Medvedev meant when he said this is the last chance for peace, he spelled it out shortly thereafter.
И такие переговоры могут позволить обрести мир. Но нужно помнить, что для киевского режима есть и другой путь, о котором тоже неоднократно говорилось. Это путь безоговорочной капитуляции. Такая формула мира в международном праве тоже существует. Если сказать прямо, многим в нашей стране она нравится куда больше.
What do you make of that last phrase there? And if I'm being honest, most of the people don't want the negotiated version. They want an unconditional surrender version.
Well, I think the thing that Medvedev was referencing here, was also the Second World War. Because beyond a certain point in the Second World War, I mean, this was the actual demand within Russia, that whatever the cost, the only way to achieve peace was through the unconditional surrender of the enemy. And I mean, the Russians very early on came to that view, and it was one that they agreed with the United States, with President Roosevelt, and that became their policy. It was almost a slogan, by the way, just to say. So this is, I think, the attitude that they have now. So the Russians have just celebrated the victory. And by the way, just to make one thing very clear, they went out of their way, everybody I spoke to went out of their way to say this was a common victory. One of the most interesting things was the remarkable absence of anger towards the West and a continuing desire to think of the United States especially as our former ally in that war. I mean, it was very surprising, and it surprised me. But nonetheless, what Medvedev is referencing is that, and he's saying this is the outcome of the previous war that we fought for the survival of Russia. And we wanted unconditional surrender then. And many, many people in Russia today feel that in some respects, this war is an echo of that greater war. Many of the issues are the same, and they feel that the right way to end it is through an unconditional surrender again. So an uncompromising mood, and it's one that people need to take into account. If this is, in my opinion, I mean, it was Ukraine is now in the last chance saloon. If it doesn't come to terms, I fully expect the war to go on, as the Russians say, to a victorious conclusion.
And what do you say to those critics, especially in the United States, that say, yeah, but Medvedev is a clown. He makes these brash statements all the time. Half the stuff he says doesn't ever come to pass. And besides all that, it's taken Russia. There was a piece in, I want to say it was the Wall Street Journal last month that said, look, if at the current pace of advance of the Russians, it would take them like another 10 years to be able to conquer all the rest of Ukraine anyway. They're not going to be able to do it. So that's just a bunch of just blather.
Yeah. Well, a few things first. I mean, he's not a clown. He's a former president. He's a former prime minister. He's the deputy head of the Security Council, and he is the head of the Military Industrial Commission. And we've spoken many times about how Russia's military industries have surged. I mean, he's the man in charge. He's the person who, to a great extent, has brought that about. So you can't call him a clown. Now, he does express the more hardline position within the Russian government. Putin and Medvedev, who are very, very closely allied with each other and who are friends. I mean, there's clearly been a division of labor. Putin is, if you like, the soft cop. He's the person who negotiates. He's the person who uses the measured language. He talks to the outside world, to the foreign leaders, he's the one who conducts the negotiations. Medvedev talks to Russians, which is what he did in this speech. He says, look, this is what we're about. This is what we want to see. We will negotiate and achieve our objectives through negotiations through a peaceful way if we can. But ultimately, if it comes to it, we will win the war and we will defeat the enemy and we will have an unconditional surrender. And that reflects the public mood. So you can't just say it's Medvedev the clown, because he speaks. What he's speaking for is the attitudes of tens of millions of people in Russia. They're not warlike, they're not angry, but they are resolute. And I think anybody who thinks otherwise is deluding themselves. Now, about the the slow pace of the Russian advance. Firstly, I don't think over the last 12 months it's actually been that particularly slow. The Ukrainian army is Ukraine is an enormous country. The battle is taking place in one particular part of eastern Ukraine. If the Russians win that battle, then they have won the war. I mean, to me, that is obvious. I think you've explained it far better than me in many articles and in many programs. And I find it very difficult to understand why people just don't get it.
Well, as it turns out, it's not just Medvedev that's having these kinds of comments. It's increasingly even the otherwise diplomatic face of the Russian government, Sergei Lavrov. Now, you mentioned earlier that the Western Europeans and the United States, and many in the United States anyway, apparently even Donald Trump, have been saying that we are pressing, in fact, we demand a 30-day unconditional ceasefire on Russia first, and then we'll talk about details secondly. And the Russians, I remember initially when President Putin and Trump first talked, Trump said, I want a ceasefire. I want to get a ceasefire. I got Zelensky to agree to an unconditional. I need you to do the same. And instead of just saying no right out the bat, Putin said, well, we'll consider that. but there's some nuances, some details we have to work out. And so a lot of people read a flexibility in there that, well, maybe they'll give into it. Well, if anybody did think that, Sergei Lavrov today squashed all of that when he was explicit in saying this.
You're putting the cart before the horse. First, we need to have a treaty, and once it is agreed upon, then we'll decide. But President Zelensky, as President Putin has repeatedly stated, lacks legitimacy. This is acknowledged even within Ukraine. Therefore, when the treaty is ready, and it is far from certain that this will happen tomorrow, it must be structured in a way that prevents a repeat of what the 2014 coup plotters, who came to power through a bloody coup, did. Only then will we see who among the Ukrainian authorities possesses legitimacy.
He says, you're putting the cart before the horse if you think we're going to have a ceasefire first. We're going to have a peace treaty first. And by the way, this one is going to have, as he said elsewhere, the issues about the root causes of the war, which are all these draconian situations that I don't think anybody in Ukraine will ever agree to. But he is declaring that we're having maximalist desires here and we're calling the shots. How do you see it?
Well, that's exactly what he said. I mean, he on the subject of a ceasefire, ever since Putin spoke about, how the Russians see the war ending, a speech he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June last year, the Russians have consistently said that they do not like the idea of a temporary ceasefire. Whenever there's been a temporary ceasefire before, Ukraine has taken advantage of it to rearm, re-equip, reinforce, rest its soldiers, and especially at a time when the Russian army is advancing and holds the advantage. From a Russian point of view, it makes no sense at all to have a ceasefire. I think, if I may say, I think it was very unfortunate that a lot of time was wasted after President Trump was inaugurated trying to get to this ceasefire. I think that whoever advised him to go down that path had not been listening to what the Russians were saying. And I think a lot of time would have been saved if President Trump had gone directly towards discussing with the Russians what the outcome of the war might be, and had agreed to push the Ukrainians towards talking with the Russians. Well, we are there now. I mean, it's perhaps unfortunate that 3 months have gone, but at least we are now there.